This program looks at the growing trend to prefabrication or modular construction through elements built off-site. Right now, designers and contractors are held to different legal standards. Designers are usually held to a professional standard of care, generally defined as the ordinary and reasonable care usually exercised by one in that profession on the same type of project at the same time in the same place under similar circumstances and conditions. By contrast, if a contractor fails to build according to the plans and specifications, which it is contractually liable to do, it's liable pursuant to the terms of its contract. A contractor cannot fail to perform and escape liability just because it met some accepted standard of care. It has to meet the contractual obligation. Off-site construction can blend those roles, or it can replace the standard applicable to design firms with a product liability standard. Here's the agenda. The construction industry is changing because of financial pressures and the capability of information sharing through building information models and technological advances. Prefabrication in the commercial construction world is accelerating. Venture capital funding has propelled the advancement of the building method, so prefabrication is becoming more compelling and more inevitable. As you know, one of the major disruptors right now is a company called Katerra, well funded by venture capitalists. It has bought a number of design firms already. It is preparing modules for kitchens and bathrooms, for other housing. It is looking into mass timber and how to use mass timber on a number of projects. It has factories now around the country, as well as contractors around the country to work with the design firms in providing new forms of mostly housing, some offices, built through prefabrication. There are many uncertainties, unknown legal aspects to the off-site construction method, and they're still being worked out. There's a blurring between subcontracting and manufacturing, and currently the two processes are treated differently by the legal system and by insurance coverage. Both design firms and construction contractors have to be aware of the difference involved in if the subcontractor is providing a service of assembling modular units or is manufacturing a module. So let's look at the use and growth of off-site construction to achieve a better understanding of the difference between manufacturing liability and the professional duty of design firms. And we also want to understand the legal environment where foreseeability of harm and the duty to design to a standard of care, the normal standard for professional services, might be replaced by absolute manufacturer's liability. Here's how the National Institute of Building Sciences defines off-site construction. Note that the emphasis here is on integrated planning and supply chain optimization as the strategy for off-site construction. Under common law, a party to the construction contract does not materially breach it if the party performs its obligations in substantial compliance with the contract terms. But if that subcontractor is a manufacturer, something called the Uniform Commercial Code applies and legal pitfalls increase. Modular manufacturers are exposed to product liability, meaning that they can be held accountable for design defects, manufacturing defects, or for information defects. And this program attempts to clarify the state of the law applying to off-site construction and availability of insurance coverage to protect all in the stream of design and construction. Here are some of the benefits of modular construction. Obviously, the first three are pretty self-evident. At least the first 2 points seem basic. Modular construction might not be cheaper, but it should be faster, and the quality should be better. The third point might really be the driving factor. For years in the construction industry, there was a reliance on cheap immigrant labor, often illegal immigrant labor, that masked inefficiencies. It was cheaper to use that level of labor rather than investing in productivity. But the constraints on cheap labor and the shortage of skilled labor because of the construction boom and the lack of investment in skills programs, contractors now face real difficulties. Now there are investments being made to raise productivity rates. You probably see every day there's some announcement of yet another investment in another system to help in the construction process. And off-site construction is just one of those things that contributes to the new emphasis on productivity. I should mention the other four. Obviously, if you're building more things off-site, the construction site becomes a lot cleaner, a lot easier to use. That means it's usually a much safer site as well. There's also the capability of decreasing waste. Often modular construction means more materials but less waste. And there's really a mitigation of contractual and site risks when you're doing more of the work off-site. Here's one of the major studies of modular construction. That is a term we will usually use, but there are many aspects of that that really change, whether it's modular, prefabricated, manufacture, or another variety of off-site construction. There are differences in techniques, codes, and legal treatment that would take a whole webinar to explain. If you look at this, it talks about faster and cost savings. Most examples of off-site construction have produced faster projects. That's because you're doing more activities at the same time. Is there a cost savings? Right now, there's probably a cost savings, again, in reduced waste and, of course, reduced time, which affects everything from the construction loans to the insurance during construction. There are challenges in both design, manufacturing, and technology because you have to integrate this off-site activity with the on-site construction activity. Note the reference to the Scandinavian use of modular construction for housing. Most cruise ships are manufactured there, and many of those same companies now create modular housing for land the same way that they make modular units to plug in the ships. And even IKEA is part of the modular housing construction effort. These points are why Marriott is using modular housing or modular construction to build hotels. Right now, a new hotel in New York City of 26 floors is the tallest prefab building, but as in the United States. But as Marriott and its suppliers learn more, we will probably be seeing fewer stick-built or bespoke projects from Marriott. They will be designed from a kit of parts and assembled using off-site built elements. As you probably know, if you delegate the design of MEP services to the contractor, the mechanical contractors have been using 3D design tools for many, many years now, and now with them are increasing their ability to really bring pre-constructed elements to the site. And the last note, at that point, mining advanced analytics, really studies have shown that even with a duplication of materials, modular construction can increase productivity and lower on-site costs significantly. Another forecaster is McGraw-Hill. I think this survey overestimates the use of prefabrication and modularization, but it is very clear that the trend will only increase unless, of course, the industry even skips over the idea of off-site construction and modular construction is replaced with on-site robotic construction and 3D printing. Some of our policyholders already have expressed a concern that between BIM and off-site construction, design decisions will be taken away from licensed design professionals in independent firms and transferred to integrated contractors and program managers who really assemble rather than construct capital asset facilities. This is not an unrealistic concern. As design build continues to grow, as it becomes legal for more types of projects, and the single point of responsibility becomes even more attractive to clients, the idea of other parties, whether they are design build entities or even finance, design, build, operate management companies, maybe large accounting firms or foreign manufacturers, will increasingly control design. That's a credible fear. The design process might not change that radically, but it will change. As prefabrication and modularization use increases, design firms will have to account for new techniques, sequences, and procedures used by contractors and demanded by owners. Here are 3 points. The second one might only be a temporary bump in the fees design firms need to be able to design to the new construction means and methods. So be aware that designing for off-site construction of elements or modules usually at this point requires more design effort so that the construction of the modules really aligns with how the manufacturing process operates. You have to have different thinking if you're going into this, if you're designing for off-site construction. And one thing that has to happen is that unlike with some on-site construction where things go slowly and decisions might be made during the construction process, with off-site construction, design decisions really must be frozen before production. So clients really must act on design recommendations early so that changes are minimized because they become far more costly with off-site construction. Some major design firms and some smaller ones that work on housing projects already have developed their own library of modules. And if they can keep their fees high while using the modules, they can be highly profitable. What we may see is that owners become accustomed to a reduction in design time through the use of modules and are not willing to pay the higher fees for that. And in fact, as we've seen with CAD and even with BIM, firms often get into a situation where their compensation is reduced as they become more efficient, and that really makes it difficult to really press for efficiency. Part of the switch to modular construction is to understand how codes and standards apply to off-site construction. In many states, there might be different laws affecting manufactured housing, for example, or for the industrialization of design elements. Some states have special inspection procedures and certification requirements for those building modules, for those building off-site elements of a construction project. And most design firms are unaware of what those certification programs or special inspections really are. So you have to be concerned in your state, has the state amended its building code for modular units, or is there a separate compliance procedure? And besides knowing the appropriate codes and standards and inspection and certification procedures, firms need to know their roles in the process. Contracts with design firms should be specific as to the role of the design firm in monitoring off-site construction and the quality of the modules being built for the project. In fact, the American Institute of Architects right now is working with a number of organizations on how to deal with this from a contractual basis. The contract obviously should clearly spell out if the design firm has a duty to examine modules during the prefabrication process. Normally, a design firm, as one of its many roles, is really a representative of the owner during the construction process and out there on the site evaluating the quality of the work of the construction team. But how does that apply when the parts of the project are being constructed off-site? And does it is different if a contractor is building modules off-site, or if they are defined by the contract as materials and supplies? You know, you could have a subcontractor simply shifting much of its work off-site, or you could have a separate company building modules as products. So that brings us to some key legal issues that could apply in off-site construction. And since insurance coverages are based on known legal liabilities, how professional liability insurance might or might not cover the off-site element of the construction of a capital asset. Now, how building codes affect off-site construction can vary. For the most part, however, standard building codes do not control the design and construction of off-site modules that are considered industrialized units. There may be different rules for their manufacture. There may be state-specific building standards for that. In addition, product liability law, which broadly refers to the legal responsibility for injury or damage resulting from the use of a product, might apply, and product liability is not covered by professional liability insurance. That's an entirely different part of the law. The legal codes or doctrines may apply the Uniform Commercial Code, which applies to the sale of goods. Product liability law is really a strict liability idea that once you put a product into the mainstream of commerce, you're responsible for that, and it's not simply based on negligence, it's an absolute liability. And there are different statutes of limitations under repose that would apply if modular units were considered products rather than simply another way of constructing the specific project. So you have to look at, additional insurance coverages, what might apply in the case. Contractors have to look at, and subcontractors have to look at what their lien rights might be under that kind of a situation. And because insurance tends to go along with the product supply chain, when is there a transfer of title? Builder's risk insurance is a good example. Not all builder's risk policies will cover off-site construction or even the transport of off-site modules to the site of the construction. So contractors and owners especially have to be concerned with what other insurance coverages there are, how they affect this type of a delivery system. And just to give you an example, we once insured a design firm that, ancillary to its normal services at the time, designed a teapot for a major retailer who manufactured them and sold them throughout the U.S. Problems occurred with those teapots, and all of a sudden we realized there was not only a frequency element. If one teapot failed, perhaps ending up scalding a user, it was highly likely that all the teapots designed the same way would fail, and you would have claims for design liability from many, many people. But there was also that possibility that the firm did not just have to meet the design liability responsibility that a design firm would normally meet, meeting the standard of care for that design, but might be subject to product liability standards. In that case, that firm ended up actually spinning off its design of things like teapots and furniture and other items to a separate unit, and that separate unit ended up with the kind of coverages it needed for product liability as well as for design liability. Now, I mentioned the UCC earlier. In the UCC, the Uniform Commercial Code really applies to the purchase of, sale and purchase of items. So in this case, the purchase of components. the UCC has been adopted by every state, not in exactly the same form, which causes law firms to go crazy or at least charge more for their services. Usually the provision of services, whether construction work or design services, is governed by the contract and not by the same things that covers the sale of goods, materials, or goods or products. When this is happening, when more things are going off-site, the parties really have to look at, is this an enforceable contract in the transaction of goods? And if so, what about the implied warranty? The question is the modular manufacturer a subcontractor or a supplier? Are modules built to specifications or provided as a product? Is there a subcontract for their creation, or is it a purchase order for the purchase of those modules? And all that really affects whether or not the Uniform Commercial Code applies. If it's a sale of goods rather than a provision of services, the UCC would apply. And if so, then there might be warranties of fitness of use and merchantability. Normal design services do not create implied warranties of fitness for use or merchantability. Your plans and specifications are not products. So you're not subject to fitness for the particular purpose or fitness for use or merchantability, which is the ability to transact business using those plans and specifications. They are not products. But what happens when you get into off-site construction? From the construction standpoint, does a substantial compliance standard apply, or as the UCC uses a perfect tender? Is that sale of goods a perfect tender of those goods? And again, who owns the module and when does the transfer take place? And who has the risk of loss? What insurance is necessary? Is that notar's risk going to cover the contractor when those things are being built off-site or being transported to the site? Is that off-site construction entities insurance covering it? Those are all factors that affect the whole process and really can have an impact on design firms as well. Now, this is a definition of coverage in the CNA professional liability insurance policy for design professionals. Most other professional liability insurers have adopted basically the same definition in their policies for design firms. Some of them have it a little bit narrower, but most of the larger insurers with market share really use about the same language as the CNA policy uses. I've underlined part of the definition because that is what that language means is very specific. Nowhere does it say that we're covering you for negligent error or negligent omission or negligent act because the policy doesn't have to. Liability in the performance of professional services means liability for harm that was both foreseeable and that resulted from the failure of the professional to meet the standard of care for the services performed. That's where the negligence in design comes. That's how all state laws on professional liability are stated. Is there a failure to meet the standard of care, and did it result in foreseeable damages? So there's not an absolute coverage that if something is wrong, you have insurance. There's responsibility and coverage. It has to be negligent performance for professional liability insurance to apply. And I also wanted to show you the standard exclusion. Every professional liability policy has an exclusion like this, where the insurer will not defend or pay for any claim this is how ours is worded, sale or distribution of goods. Now, again, it arises out of the sale or distribution of goods or products or by others licensed by the insured. It does not apply to custom-built furniture or furnishings or equipment that are created or even modified for a specific client. And it doesn't apply to things like software that's developed for specific use. It would, however, apply to, for instance, software that's put into the mainstream of commerce. So I wanted to discuss this because depending on how off-site construction is set up, the design firm might actually become involved not only in the design of a modular assembly, but with the sale of that produced element as a product. Thus, the professional liability exclusion for the sale or distribution of goods would be triggered. And we'll look at some examples of this later. Okay, as stated earlier, even if a design firm is not involved in the manufacture, sale, or distribution of a good, it could still be subject to product liability exposure. Prefabricated or modular elements might be treated no differently than any other products put into a capital asset. Usually, the design of a project and the plans and specifications for that project are not subject to implied warranties, merchantability of fitness, and fitness for use, as we pointed out earlier. While design services are governed by contractual obligations and the professional standard of care, the actual production and sale of modules could be subject to the Uniform Commercial Code. And the exposure of design firm could be based both on strict liability and tort for a product design and governed by the state version of the UCC. And, you know, again, professional liability does not cover strict liability or that what you end up with if you have product liability applied to what you do. And you know, it is only based on your negligent performance in the design. Now, we're going to look at some scenarios for design firms, how they could be involved in this and how it may matter to them both from an exposure standpoint and from an insurance coverage standpoint. So we'll discuss some scenarios where a firm is involved at various levels in the off-site construction process. Remember that as we go through these scenarios, at some point we go from a situation where professional liability insurance provides coverage for a design firm in the design of modular units for a specific project or for the prototype design of modules, to a situation where professional liability insurance will not provide coverage for the design of modular units that will be sold as mass-produced products. As firms look at expanding their role in the process, they also should be looking to expand their insurance coverage through appropriate policies. Again, the more likely the firm will have greater exposure if it becomes involved in the actual production of a modular unit. You know, especially if those modular units are used on more than one project or placed into the commercial marketplace, they may be considered products. Now, this is what might be considered normal for design firm services on a project. You can become extensively involved in the design of components or modules, including the means and methods of prefabricating them, and still be providing a professional service. You know, the fact that you're involved in things like means and methods, techniques, sequences, and procedures does not void your professional liability insurance coverage. Those are usually in the hands of the contractor because of the way the American system of design bid build was set up. Once a contractor bid on a project, or once a contractor negotiated a fee on a project, it is saying that using those plans and specifications, it can build that project for that amount of money if you let the contractor use the best means available to that contractor. So at that point, means, methods, techniques, sequences, and procedures became the contractor's responsibility, and the contractor's really way of making more money on a project. You can always dictate means, methods, techniques, sequences, and procedures before the bid. You can always tell a contractor how you want something built in more detail. And as we see with BIM, that often happens. That doesn't negate your professional liability coverage. It does get you into trouble if you interfere with the contractor after the bid process, because again, the contractor has the ability to use whatever means, methods, techniques, sequences, and procedures are best for that contractor. You do need to be aware of what your duties under various state laws might be and what your contractual obligations to your client are as to your monitoring of the process to determine if the modules meet quality requirements of the contract and the contractor's schedule. Again, that exposure should be similar to any project design, and thus it would be covered by your professional liability insurance. Now, you move up the step if you're designing prototypes. If you're designing something that's going to be used on multiple projects. And that multiple projects really depends on how they're defined. Obviously, if you're using designing modular elements that are going to be used in the housing development, the exposure might be greater, but the coverage is still a design liability, professional liability coverage. If the fee is for one-time design of a prototype, whether it's housing or whether it's fast food restaurants, that still is a professional service. And the exposure even is less if, for instance, the design of that prototype ends up having to be tied into the site by a different designer of record, because that designer of record, when they get the plans approved locally, is really telling the world that it's taking responsibility for that design. But the exposure could be significant because of the repetitive problem. If you make a negligent design error and that is repeated for multiple uses of the prototype, your exposure would be great. Your coverage will still be there in place to cover the costs, losses, and damages caused by your negligent design, but the risk is intensified because of the multiple uses. And you see that when you're doing condos or anything else that has multiple identical design elements, that exposure could be significant. So if you translate that to offsite construction, again, your exposure could be significant. And in fact, could be so significant that you may be having a difficult time finding professional liability insurance coverage for that, because the risk compared to the fee would be so great that professional liability insurance cannot charge you enough based on your fees to cover that huge loss area of losses that could come in from the use of multiple units. Now, if you create a performance specification for a module, again, that should be classified as a professional service. Some firms will see modular units as delegated design functions, and a firm's only duty will be to create the performance specifications that must be met by the construction contractor or modular contractor. Usually, the performance specifications will be met because the contractor will use an independent design professional hired by the construction contractor, or an employed design professional, someone licensed who works in the contractor's office, who will take responsibility for the final design to meet the performance criteria. Now, an increased risk could happen depending on the duty of the design professional to verify if the actual designed and prefabricated modules meet the performance criteria. Usually, you don't have that obligation, but you could, by contract, And there are some states where state law applicable to delegated design puts the responsibility for assessing whether or not the design by another design professional meets the performance criteria on the designer of record for that project. So even creating a performance specification would be covered by professional liability insurance, but that exposure could increase significantly if contractually or by state law you're required to verify that the final design meets the performance criteria. And you really start getting into a difficult area when you're designing a module and being paid on a royalty basis when the modules are used on separate projects. Because the royalty payments really could cause a module to be considered a product with product liability implications. So the risk to a design firm could increase significantly if the design firm module that is meant to be used on multiple projects ends up being getting a royalty payment for the original designer. That royalty payment is evidence that the design firm has continuing responsibility because of the payment per use. Now, this often happens to engineering firms that create a solution for a contractor on one project and then market the same solution to others based on the payment of a royalty fee. At some point, the design firm moves from designing a specific project to designing a manufactured product. And as the slide states, if that is considered a product, then the exposure would be based on strict liability and tort with the implied warranties of merchantability of fitness and fitness of use. So that could compromise your professional liability. And then if you get into the involvement in the design, production, and sale of units for projects by others, and this is tempting to do with that, and we don't want to discourage you from doing that. You may end up in the situation where some of your risk is covered by professional liability insurance, but not product liability claims that will come your way. Again, exposure could be based on both on strict liability and tort for a product design, and even governed by the state version of the UCC. Now, some firms might want to become product designers and profit from the sale of modules. That's fine, but you have to recognize that this is where the exposure could increase significantly and go far beyond professional liability coverage. Design liability insurance and normal professional liability coverage would back the firm for some of this risk, but not for its product. Now, this, again, we're seeing a trend, and we're actually seeing a backward trend. Many of the product manufacturers in this country have fought for years before Congress to get a national standard that would say where design liability stops and where product liability starts. Because if you're manufacturing a car or a teapot, you probably want to have some of your liability in design liability, because that would be governed by a standard of care. So if a manufacturer could say, no, for that you cannot sue me for product liability will only cover the actual manufacture of this, the design of this would be covered by design liability, they could shift from an absolute liability for defect in a product to one that might be governed by a standard of care. So again, both from the manufacturing standpoint and from the construction standpoint, we're seeing more of a discussion of where design ends and where manufacturing begins. I think that if you're working on modular units, especially modular units that can be used for more than one project and that will be sold on the open market, you're not going to end up being held responsible for design liability, because the absolute liability of creating a product is far more of a risk to you. It will be easier to define, to prove, and to collect damages for. So let's do a little summary of exposure control and insurability. There are concerns you should have as the industry continues to evolve and more of your efforts are aimed at design projects to be built from modules created offsite. You have to understand what product liability in a UCC could do to your exposure. You have to think about your contract, including your role in evaluating offsite construction. Again, that may be a significant part of your duty that the client wants to assign to you. And it's one thing to visit a site as things are being installed or things being created on the site. It's another thing to go to manufacturing facilities or off-site construction facilities and check out the quality of the workmanship at that point. If you become creative in your compensation system, such as charging a royalty or some other basis on the sale of these goods, you should be aware that such creativity could give others an expectation that your responsibility is for much more than your negligent performance of professional services. So I will end with this. The construction industry is changing. You need to understand that change and your place in that changed construction industry. Much of this change will accelerate the master builder image, but that image probably won't be of design firms, but rather of construction contractors or others controlling the entire process. You can design to expand your service, decide to expand your services, and probably stay within the scope of your professional liability insurance coverage. But as you create your own preferred future in this new world of offsite construction, you should be aware that you might need other insurance coverage in addition to professional liability insurance. So, again, just to go over some of the issues that you need to be aware of, your professional liability insurance coverage applies to the design of modular units for a specific project or prototype design of modules. Designing a prototype for use on multiple projects is a professional liability exposure, but that exposure is usually much greater than the design of a specific project. Professional liability insurance for design firms does not apply to the design of modular units that will be sold as mass-produced products. And while design services are normally governed by contractual obligations and a standard of care, that the actual production and sale of modules could be subject to the Uniform Commercial Code and to product liability, which broadly refers to the legal responsibility for injury or damage resulting from the use of a product. That is not covered by professional liability insurance. And, again, be aware that your contracts should be specific as to your role in monitoring offsite construction and the quality of the modules being built for the project. Unless you have pre-designed modules, unless you've been experienced in this and are doing a specific project type and have your own design elements pre-designed, you should be aware that the design of off-site construction of elements or modules usually require more design effort so that the construction aligns with the manufacturing process. So don't allow a client to shortchange you on compensation because you may be spending a lot more time in the initial design of the module so that they can be built off-site, and you may be spending a lot more time looking at modules built off-site as part of your evaluation of the work of a construction contractor. Okay, and with that, I noticed we don't really have that many questions. We have some questions on strict liability, and I don't think there's any easy answer when you're talking about strict liability in the design of a offsite module. The idea that designers may be strictly held for strict liability for their designs is actually a growing trend. Firms are doing their best to stay within the standards, the negligence standards as design professionals, but depending on what kind of projects you're building, especially with housing, there is more and more of an effort by courts to look at what you do as doing something that strict liability may apply to. So we will answer any other questions you have online, but for right now, I want to end with that. And, again, please check your insurance coverages as you go up this chain of possibilities that offsite construction presents as an opportunity for you.